are going to see the King. Soon and very soon, we are going to see the King. Soon
Welcome to Televisit with the Bible, presented by Churches of Christ in the Shoals.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, we're going to see the King.
Welcome to Televisit with the Bible. My name is Ed Gallagher of Heritage Christian University. Listen to this quote. This is from the Harvard Business Review from 1927. So what is that, like 90 years ago? This is a quote from a fellow named Paul Mazur. He was writing an article in that journal, and he said in that article, "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old has been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs." What do you think about somebody writing those words in the Harvard Business Review of 1927? He is essentially advising business leaders that they need to concentrate their advertising on making sure that people buy their product, not because they need their product, but just because they want it. He is suggesting to these business leaders that they need to shape people's desires, to train them to want what they have to offer them. Well, I think it's in some ways a little bit creepy that somebody would write that kind of thing and be so explicit about that attitude. On the other hand, I think it is a good insight into human personality, because he is absolutely right. Our desires can be trained. Our hearts can be led in a certain direction. It is not the case that the heart has its desires of which reason knows nothing, and the heart just wants what it wants and you can't really help it. No, that's not true. You can train your heart. You can shape your heart in a particular direction. You can train your desires. When I was growing up, I'd drink skim milk. That was what our family bought all the time, and every once in a while, for some reason, I would have the opportunity to drink some whole milk. And man, I thought it was disgusting. It was like drinking heavy cream or something. It was awful. I was used to skim milk. Sometimes I'd go to school and I'd buy the little carton and it would be 2%, and even that just tasted nasty to me. Skim milk is what milk ought to taste like. Well, then I grew up and I had kids, and with kids, after they've weaned them from nursing, you're supposed to give them sort of a more high-fat content milk. And so we bought whole milk for the kids, and my wife and I would actually buy whole milk for the kid, and she also grew up with skim milk, and we would buy skim milk for ourselves, until finally, after some time of doing that, we decided, this is too much milk buying. Let's just buy whole milk. We'll get used to it. Well, you know what? We got used to it. And I've been drinking whole milk for, I don't know how long, 15 years now. And if I taste some skim milk, that tastes terrible. Skim milk is like drinking water. It's not even milk at all. Whole milk is the way milk is supposed to taste. It has some flavor to it. My desires have been trained. I know a fella that whenever his wife put his plate on the table, he would automatically, without even thinking about it, he would grab the salt and sprinkle salt all over it. Until one day his doctor told him, "You got to lay off the salt." And so he got out of the habit of grabbing that salt, and after some period of months or years, he told me he doesn't miss the salt anymore. He has trained his desires to not need that. Your desires can be, your heart can be shaped. Think about Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon is a new king. He's a young man. He has come to the throne left to him by his father David. And an appearance of God comes, and God asks Solomon, Solomon, ask anything you want. I'll give you anything you want. If you want riches, I'll give it to you. If you want long life, I'll give it to you. If you want great power, anything you want, I'll give to you. And Solomon said to God, more than anything in the world, what I desire, what my heart longs for, is to serve you with wisdom and justice and faithfulness, God. I want to please you. I have been put in charge of this great people, and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a young man. God, more than anything in the world, I want wisdom. Give me wisdom so that I can lead this people in the way you want me to lead them. As a young man, Solomon wanted wisdom so that he could serve God in the most pure and faithful manner possible as the leader of God's people. Fast forward 40 years. 1 Kings chapter 11. Things have changed. Solomon, as you may recall, had gotten involved with a lot of women, and that's an understatement. I think it was 300 wives and 700 concubines, and he had been marrying women, not just a bunch of women, but women from specific places, because he wanted to create these political alliances with Egypt or with Tyre and Sidon and different places. And so he would marry these women from foreign cultures, and he would, these women worshiped other gods. And he would actually build temples for their gods. And the text says in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, that these pagans that Solomon had brought into his kingdom, they turned his heart. 1 Kings 11, verse 4, they turned his heart away from God. When he was a young man, his heart was directed wholly at God, and more than anything in the world, he wanted to serve God with wisdom. But at the end of his life, his heart had been trained. He had been shaped in a different direction. And it illustrates the truth of Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart, for in it lies the springs of life. That's what Moses was getting at in Deuteronomy chapter 6, in this famous passage that Jews call the Shema, Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 and following. Deuteronomy takes place on the plains of Moab. This is after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 40 years earlier, Moses had led the children of Israel out of Egypt. They had wandered in the wilderness 40 years, and Deuteronomy takes place just on the cusp of the Promised Land. Moses is not going to go into the Promised Land himself. He has already been told by God that he will die outside the Promised Land, and that in fact Joshua will lead them in. Joshua will take them into the Promised Land. And so this is Moses' farewell address. This is the last chance he will get to speak to Israel before he dies, and they go into this new environment they have never been to before. Sort of like when a parent is sending their child out into the world, maybe off to college, and might just offer them some advice before they leave the house. Just remember some of the things I've tried to teach you. remember this and remember that. Well, that's sort of what Deuteronomy is. It's Moses' farewell address, his last chance to remind Israel of what he has tried to teach them. And so in this environment, what is it that Moses says to them? He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." That's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. He continues, look what he says in verse 6. "These words that I am giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates." See, these various ways that Moses tells the children of Israel, you need to write these down, you need to think about these all the time, because this is the most important thing. As Moses says farewell to the children of Israel, and he's sending them off into a world they don't know about. They're going off to be in a land full of pagans, a land full of people who believe different things from they do. And he says, before you take another step, before you go any further, you need to settle something right now. Love God with everything that you are. Before you go any further, settle this matter in your heart and in your mind. Love God. That's the primary responsibility for the children of Israel, for the people of God. In the way Moses tells the children of Israel to love God, you can see that there is no room for compartmentalization. In other words, they can't put God in one category and reserve their heart or their mind or their strength in part for other categories. In other words, they don't love God with, let's say, 50% of their heart and mind, as if I will give half of my life to God. I think sometimes we think about it in those terms, that if we're sort of dividing up our lives into different categories, well, God, if we're going to be a good Christian, that means God needs to have the biggest category, and then work needs to have a smaller percentage of my life than God, and then family needs to have sort of a smaller percentage of my life than God. I need to spend time with my kids and love them, but I need to give them a smaller percentage than God. That's what it means when we say, that loving God is primary, and then loving others, loving family and loving others, that it sort of goes in that order, and then you have these percentages. We think about it sometimes in those terms. Or maybe we would say that not just God needs to have the biggest percentage, but that God needs to have like more than 50%. He needs to have like where all the other categories don't add up to as big as God in our lives. But Moses would respond to that way of thinking with a strong, emphatic, no, that is not the point. You don't love God with the biggest percentage of your heart. You love God with your entire heart. Not with the biggest percentage of your mind and strength, but with all of your mind, all of your strength. So that if you love in some ways your work, you love your work as a part of this wider thing of what it means to love and serve God. If you love your family as you should, you love your family as a part of this wider thing of your life as dedicated to God. Loving family comes under the wider umbrella of loving God, but it is all about loving God with your entire heart, your entire mind, your entire strength. That's what Moses says. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? How could you get to that point? How could you love God in that way? Well, Moses tells us some ways. He says what you need to do is you need to teach it. It says teach it to your kids. You need to talk about these things to your kids. He says, teach it. And you know, if any of you have taught anything in any context, that the teacher always learns more than the student. And so if you are teaching others to do this kind of thing, you are reinforcing it in your own life as well. He says, what you need to do, Moses says, is you need to talk about this. You need to talk about loving God in this way. Well, Moses, when should we talk about it? Well, Moses says you need to talk about it when you are lying down at night. And you need to talk about it when you are getting up in the morning. You need to talk about it when you are sitting in your house. And you need to be talking about it when you're walking on the road. You need to talk about it when you're lying down and when you're not lying down. You need to be talking about it when you're sitting in your house and when you're not sitting in your house. In other words, you need to be talking about this all the time. This loving God needs to sort of characterize who you are as a human being, so much so that it's always on your lips. You're always talking about the love of God. If you want to love God in this way, Moses says you need to write this down. You got to write it down. Where should we write it down? Well, Moses says write it down on your hand. You know, some of you will write notes. I'll write notes sometimes on my hand. That's a good place to look, and you'll see it on your hand, and it'll remind you. But Moses even says write it on your forehead. You can't see it if you write it on your forehead, but other people will see it, and they will tell you got something on your forehead. It will remind you of what you are supposed to be doing. Write it on your doorposts, Moses even says. You'll see it as you leave your house. You'll see it as you come. Write it in places where you will obviously see it. That's the point. Continuously remind yourselves of the kind of person you're supposed to be. That's what Moses says. And the reason you need to do that is because everything depends on this. That's what Jesus says. Jesus answered this question. This is Matthew 22, verses 34 and following. Some people came up to Jesus and said, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus says, "Well, that's an easy one." And he quotes our passage here, Deuteronomy 6. It says, "Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." That's the greatest command right there. He says the second one is like it, and that's love your neighbor as yourself. And that comes from Leviticus 19, verse 18. But the greatest command is loving God. And then he says, Jesus says in that passage, verse 40, this is Matthew 22, verse 40, "For all the law and the prophets depend on these two commands," about loving God and loving others. You see, everything depends on this, loving God and loving others as a part of what it means to love God. Listen to this quote from Augustine. Speaking to God, he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until we find rest in you." Our heart is restless until we find rest in you. Or another medieval Christian, Bernard of Clairvaux, said, You want me to tell you why God is to be loved and how much? I answer, the reason for loving God is God Himself. And the measure of love due to Him is immeasurable love. That's what we're called to. That's what Moses calls us to. That's what Jesus reminds us of. The greatest command, loving God. Sometimes that is difficult. And I'm reminded of something C.S. Lewis said in his book, Mere Christianity. He's got this chapter called Charity, which is as you know, it's the old-timey word for love. And so his chapter, Charity, his chapter on love, he says that, and he's talking specifically about loving other people, but I think we can say this about loving God as well. He says sometimes other people are just hard to love. Sometimes it is not easy to love these other people. And so what do? C.S. Lewis said, what you do is you act like you love them anyway. And he says, what you will find is that if you will act like you love them, if you will do the things that love would do toward them, you will find that the emotion of love will come later, but the actions of love will bring in the emotion. So do what love would do. Serve other people. These people that are hard to love, serve them in certain ways. Be sure to interact with them in loving ways. And you will find that the emotion comes with it. And I think we can apply the same sort of logic to God. There might be times, in fact, there might be a lot of times, that we don't feel the emotion that we think we ought to feel with loving God. And so what we should do is act like it anyway. What would we do if we really had that love of God that we desire? We would serve others. We would worship. We would do certain other things. We would read Scripture and pray. And maybe we won't have that emotional feeling all the time, but it will grow and we will become more spiritual and more in love with God the more we dedicate ourselves to acting like it. We shouldn't just wait for the emotion to come. We need to train our hearts to love God, to desire godly things. And along with that, what we need to do if we're going to love God in the way we ought to is we need to practice loving God. And that's what we do when we come together for worship on Sundays or throughout the week or even through our private devotionals. But I'm thinking specifically about coming together as the corporate body, as the church, and worshiping God in that context, that we are engaged in practicing loving God. Think about practice. I take my kids to baseball practice, to softball practice. They used to do soccer, and I am thankful they don't do that anymore because I didn't understand anything about soccer. I understand a little bit about baseball. And when you go to baseball practice, what you're going to do is you're going to do the same things over and over and over and over again. And if you want to get good at hitting a baseball, what you should do is go to practice and hit a baseball over and over and over again. Now, let me tell you, it doesn't do any good to go to practice one time and take one swing at a baseball and say, well, I have practiced. That's not going to do you any good at all. That is not the way to get good at hitting a baseball. If you want to get good, what you've got to do is you've got to go to practice and you have to take that swing at that baseball, 50 times, 100 times today. And if you want to get good at fielding, you've got to go out there and you've got to take grounders not just one grounder, you've got to keep doing it over and over and over again. Take these grounders and make that throw to first base or second base, wherever the runner is. You've got to keep doing it. But you can't just do it today. Even if you take 100 swings today and then stop, that's not going to do you any good. You've got to come back the next week and do it all over again. I think about these great NBA players like LeBron James or Kevin Durant or others. They are fantastic basketball players. They are the greatest players in the world. There are no other people as good at basketball as them. And so that means that they don't ever practice, right? Of course not. It means that they go and practice harder than anybody else. That's what they do. They go and into the gym when they're not playing, and they shoot, and they shoot, and they shoot, and they shoot, and they practice their turnaround jumper, and they do their dribble exercise. They practice and practice and practice. That's how you improve at something. If we want to love God, what we need to do is we need to practice. And what that's going to look like is we're going to come to a worship service and we're going to sing the same songs that we have sung for years and years and years. But those songs are supposed to be our practice for loving God. They are training us, shaping our hearts, molding our character into love of God. And it's not a bad thing at all that we sing the same words week by week. That's the way we practice. That's how we get good at it. And we're going to go through the same motions, just like a baseball player swinging that bat who needs to go through the exact same motions over and over. We're going to go through the same motions. We're going to take that little piece of bread and put it in our mouth. And we're going to take the little piece of bread and put it in our mouth week by week. We're going to take the little cup and drink down the grape juice. And we're going to do that week by week. And we're going to listen to people lead us in prayer, and there will be a lot of times that they say the exact same words over and over and over, week by week, and they are training us to love God. You see, baseball practice, swinging that bat, it's not rote or meaningless unless you do it without thinking about it, unless you're simply going through the motions, but doing it with intention and motivation behind it, that's how you get better at something. And for us, coming week by week and practicing loving God, not in a going through the motions kind of way or a rote, meaningless repetition way, but understanding the significance of the actions that we're partaking in. Understanding the significance of hearing the same verses preached to us over and over again. Understanding the significance and desiring to improve in our own spiritual lives and in our own love toward God. That's how we're going to fulfill Moses' instructions to us in Deuteronomy 6 and what Jesus said to us in Matthew 22. That's how we're going to shape our hearts into the love of God.